there's about 100% chance that you and everything you think you know isn't real. And I'm going to prove it to you here mathematically. Consider the timeline from the very beginning of the universe, where it slowly developed, atoms formed, stars and galaxies began to be created, and somewhere along the line, Earth was created, life emerged, and we are where we are now. Now, as we continue progressing and developing, there are two main possibilities for our future. Either we completely annihilate ourselves, or get annihilated, or we continue advancing onto an astoundingly technologically advanced state of being, which, for now, I'll dub as post-humanity. The definition here is a little loose, but for now we can just denote that post-human civilizations are those that have the capabilities to run major simulations. Now, what kinds of simulations? Let's start from the very extreme case and say that they can create universal simulations, which, as the name suggests, are the history of the universe. When they do, they might end up making 10 or so simultaneous simulations, which all have their own cycles of life, and might begin to run their own simulations. 10 becomes 100, which becomes 1,000, and so on and so forth. Now, you might be able to tell that statistically, if we compare the ratio of how many simulated beings there are in the universe, compared to the total number of life forms, and pardon me for not being extremely rigorous here, but you're basically guaranteed to be one of the simulated life forms. But this entire chain of thought in of itself seems totally ridiculous. Simulating the entire universe within the universe itself? It's fairly unlikely, if not completely impossible. But here's the thing. We don't actually need to simulate the whole universe, nor do we even need a recursion of simulations. All we need are ancestor simulations, or what can be known as the ability to simulate the history of our own planet. That sounds far more reasonable, and I'll get to how feasible this is in a moment. But first, now that you have an idea of where the argument is going, let's consider mathematically, like I promised, the implications of the ancestor simulations in the scale of not just the Earth, like we did before, but across all civilizations in the universe. Some fraction of them might inevitably self-destruct before they even make it to a post-human stage. We'll denote the fraction of all civilizations that do actually survive long enough as f sub p. Now, before we move on, we should also note that regardless of whether these civilizations all made it to post-humanity or not, they would have had some individual total population. We can generalize their populations here with H, and call it the average number of life forms that have lived in any civilization before a post-human era. Now, not all of these civilizations will actually be interested in hosting ancestor simulations, so we don't need to consider them either. Therefore, we can denote the fraction of these post-human societies that will actually host at the very least one ancestor simulation as f sub I. They all might run differing amounts of simulations, but we can, once again, take the average number of simulations that they do run and denote this as n. Now, since all of these ancestor simulations are simulating the history of each of those civilizations' planets, we can also see that our value h also represents the average population in each of these simulations as well. Now, we can try to determine what the chance that we ourselves are simulated beings is. So, the average number of simulated beings can just be determined via this product. And then the average number of total beings hosted by a civilization is just that same value plus another h. For all the number of original life forms that lived in that civilization, that means that the fraction of our simulated beings in the universe gets simplified down to this value. Now, you might be able to see that our chance of being a simulated life form is basically entirely dependent on this term. If it's even something just like 10, then we already have about a 91% chance of being simulated. So that finally brings us to the most pressing question, just about how reasonable are ancestor simulations, and how big can n actually be? This is a tough question to answer, but if we just take a second to think that a post-human civilization might have access to energy across multiple solar systems, if not more, just by nature of the fact that they're extremely advanced, then they have a lot of resources. And if we go by some estimates with regards to a planet-sized computer, which again, sounds really ridiculous, but suspend your disbelief here because we're talking about extremely advanced civilizations, then they could create machines that could run 10 to the power 42 operations per second. And with some estimates putting the requirement of simulating life on Earth at just 10 to the power 36 operations, even if we don't allocate 100% of resources into making ancestor simulations, N can be really big. Now, With our estimation for n, there are really only three possibilities. Either basically every civilization in the universe will self-destruct before they reach post-humanity. Either they all just collectively decide to not run any ancestor simulations at all, or we ourselves must simply just be simulated.